At 80, my family sent me to a nursing home, but they never imagined I had a secret fortune. The day they dropped me off at Peaceful Gardens retirement home remains etched in my memory with painful clarity. My son Richard's face, a careful mask of reassurance barely concealing his relief. My daughter-in-law Patricia's brisk efficiency as she unpacked my meager allowed possessions. My granddaughter Emily's genuine distress, the only honest emotion in that sterile room with its hospital-cornered bed and emergency call button prominently positioned on the wall. "It's for the best, Dad," Richard said, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "After the fall and then forgetting the stove, we just can't take the risk anymore." I nodded silently, not trusting myself to speak. What could I say? That at 80 years old, I was being discarded like outdated furniture? That after a lifetime of independence, I was now reduced to scheduled meals and supervised medication? That the small apartment they'd selected, though among the best this facility offered, felt like a prison cell compared to the home I'd built with my own hands nearly 50 years ago. "You'll make friends," Patricia added, arranging my toiletries in the tiny bathroom. "There's bingo on Tuesdays, and the social director said they have a book club." Bingo. As if that could replace the woodworking shop in my garage where I'd spent countless hours crafting furniture that would outlast me. As if discussing mass-market paperbacks could substitute for my evening ritual of reading engineering journals on the porch, watching the sunset over the land that had been in my family for generations, the land they'd sold to finance my care. "We'll visit every Sunday," Richard promised as they prepared to leave, checking his watch surreptitiously. "And Emily can come by after school sometimes. It's only 15 minutes from her high school." Only Emily lingered, her 16-year-old face troubled. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "This isn't right." "It's all right. Sunshine," I assured her, though we both knew it wasn't. "You focus on your studies. Don't worry about your old grandpa." After they left, I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the sanitized remnants of my life. Family photos carefully framed, my favorite sweater, 3 books from my extensive library, my wedding ring, still on my finger despite Martha being gone for 5 years now. What they didn't leave me was my dignity, or my freedom, or any acknowledgement of the financial empire I had quietly built over decades. The secret fortune that none of them, not even my late wife, had ever suspected existed. They thought they were tucking away a financially dependent old man whose modest teacher's pension and Social Security wouldn't cover in-home care. They had no idea that Harold Jenkins, former high school physics teacher and seemingly frugal, retiree, was worth over $30 million. And I had no intention of enlightening them, at least not in the way they might expect. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the small notebook that contained the information I would need. Account numbers, contacts. The carefully constructed plan I had developed over the past 2 years as I observed my son's increasing impatience with my aging and his thinly veiled interest in my property. Patience, I whispered to myself, a lifetime habit when facing challenges. Strategic thinking wins in the end. I had taught that to generations of students, using chess as a metaphor for problem solving. Now I would apply it to my own situation. My family had made their move, believing they had corralled me into checkmate. They had no idea I was still several moves ahead. Peaceful Gardens was neither particularly peaceful nor remotely garden-like. The building had been a small hospital in the 1970s, later converted to a nursing facility with minimal alterations beyond cosmetic touches. The halls were wide enough for gurneys, now used for laundry carts and food trolleys. The nursing station dominated the central intersection like an institutional fortress. The dining room, with its institutional tables and chairs bolted to the floor for safety, offered all the ambiance of a prison cafeteria. My first week passed in a fog of adjustment and strategic observation. I noted the staff rotations, identified which nurses treated residents with respect versus condescension, and carefully projected the image expected of me, a compliant, slightly confused old man grateful for the care being provided. "You're settling in nicely, Mr. Jenkins," remarked Nurse Cheryl, the floor supervisor, as she checked my blood pressure during morning rounds. "Some folks take months to adjust." I smiled benignly. "Just making the best of things." "That's the spirit? And your son called to check on you yesterday. Such a caring family you have." I nodded, swallowing the bitter retort that rose in my throat. Richard had indeed called, not to speak with me, but to ensure my medication schedule was being followed, and to remind the staff that I sometimes gets confused about money matters. A preemptive move to discredit any financial assertions I might make. Strategic indeed. My son had learned something from me after all. On my 8th day at Peaceful Gardens, I met Eleanor Sullivan. She was arranging flowers in the common room, her movements precise despite gnarled, arthritic fingers. Unlike most residents who shuffled about in slippers and institutional garb, Eleanor wore a crisp blouse, tailored slacks, and actual shoes. Her silver hair was styled in a neat bob, and she wore a simple pearl necklace that I immediately recognized as genuine. "Those are lovely," I remarked, approaching the arrangement. "Dahlias were my wife's favorite." Eleanor glanced up, assessing me with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Thank you. I had them delivered from town. The plastic monstrosities they keep here were offending my sensibilities." Her forthright manner made me smile, the first genuine smile since arriving. "Harold Jenkins," I said, extending my hand. "Eleanor Sullivan." Her handshake was firm and confident. "New arrival?" "8 days in. You?" "3 interminable months." She positioned a final bloom and stepped back to evaluate her work. "They tell me I'll adjust eventually." "And will you?" Those piercing eyes met mine again, a flash of defiance in them. "I will appear to adjust, Mr. Jenkins. There's a difference." In that moment, I recognized a kindred spirit, someone else playing the long game in an environment designed to strip away autonomy and identity. "A crucial difference, Mrs. Sullivan." "Eleanor, please. If we're to be fellow inmates, we might as well dispense with formalities." "Harold, then." Over the following weeks, Eleanor and I fell into a pattern of taking afternoon tea together in the common room. She had somehow secured permission for a small electric kettle in her room. "My daughter is on the board of directors for the hospital network that owns this place," she explained with a mischievous smile, and brewed proper tea rather than the tepid colored water offered by the facility. During these tea sessions, I learned that Eleanor had been a professor of economics at the State University, widowed for 12 years, and placed in Peaceful Gardens after a minor stroke that had affected her balance but left her mind razor-sharp. "My children decided I was at fall risk," she explained, her tone making clear her opinion of this assessment. "Apparently that single phrase is sufficient to upend 8 decades of independence." "My son used exactly the same term," I noted. "Along with cognitive concerns because I occasionally misplaced my glasses." Eleanor snorted delicately. "Yes, because young people never misplace anything. Patricia, my daughter, called me in a panic last month because she couldn't find her car in the shopping center parking lot. Perhaps we should have her evaluated." Our shared gallows humor made the institutional constraints more bearable, but beneath our witticisms lay genuine frustration and pain. We were both victims of well-intentioned but fundamentally disrespectful decisions made about us rather than with us. During our 3rd week of afternoon teas, Eleanor lowered her voice and asked, "Do you have a plan, Harold?" I hesitated, decades of secrecy making me cautious. "A plan? For getting out of here or at least reclaiming some control. You don't strike me as a man who accepts defeat easily." Her perception was unsettling but also oddly comforting. "I might have some ideas," I admitted carefully. "And you?" And Let's just say I didn't spend 40 years teaching financial strategy without learning a few things about leveraging assets and timing markets. She sipped her tea, watching me over the rim. Perhaps we could compare notes sometime, in a more private setting. And so began our conspiracy. Two octogenarians plotting against the system that had relegated us to the margins of our own lives. Richard and Patricia maintained their promised Sunday visits, arriving promptly at 2 p.m. and departing at 3:30, their obligation neatly fulfilled. Each visit followed the same pattern: awkward updates about their lives, cursory inquiries about my activities, and thinly veiled assessments of my mental state. "Dad seems to be doing well," Richard would remark to Patricia, as if I weren't sitting right there. "Yes, the staff says he's participating in programs," Patricia would reply, equally disembodied. Only Emily broke this pattern, visiting me separately on Thursday afternoons after school. Unlike her parents, she spoke to me directly, her teenaged candor refreshing after the carefully sanitized conversations with Richard and Patricia. "This place is depressing, Grandpa," she declared during her second visit. "How can you stand it?" "I focus on what I can control, not what I can't," I replied, the same advice I'd given her when she struggled with algebra the previous year. "But they basically imprisoned you here. After everything you did for Dad, too. It's not fair." Her righteous indignation warmed my heart, even as I cautioned her. "Life isn't always fair, sunshine, and your parents believe they're doing what's best. Best for them, maybe," she muttered. "They've already started cleaning out your house to put it on the market." This information, while not surprising, still stung. The house I'd built when Richard was just a boy, where I'd taught him to hammer, nails and red blueprints where Martha and I had hosted decades of family Christmases and summer barbecues, reduced to a real estate transaction. "They mentioned turning your workshop into a home gym before they sell," Emily continued, oblivious to the pain her words caused. "Dad said your tools would bring good money at auction, but some of the bigger equipment might go to scrap." My hands tightened on the armrests of my chair. The workshop contained tools passed down from my father and grandfather, quality craftsmanship from an era before planned obsolescence. My lathe alone was a century old, lovingly maintained and still, producing precision work that modern machines couldn't match. "Emily," I said, keeping my voice steady, "would you do something for me? Without telling your parents?" Her eyes widened with interest. "Like what?" "Next time you're at the house, could you check my workshop for a small red notebook? It should be in the bottom drawer of my tool chest under the socket wrenches." "Sure," she agreed readily. "What's in it?" "Just some notes about my tools. Sentimental value." Not entirely a lie, though far from the complete truth. The notebook contained additional account information and contacts I hadn't transferred to, the one in my possession. "I'll look for it on Saturday. Dad's making me help with the sorting." After Emily left, I sat quietly processing this new information. The accelerated timeline for selling the house meant I needed to adjust my own plans. Accordingly, what I had envisioned as a 3-month strategy might need to be compressed into weeks. That evening, I spoke with Eleanor about this development during our now daily walk around the facility grounds. A concrete path that circled the building exactly twice before returning to the main entrance, offering the illusion of freedom, within strictly defined boundaries. "They're selling my house sooner than expected," I explained as we navigated the path at Eleanor's careful pace, her cane tapping rhythmically on the concrete. "And liquidating my workshop." Eleanor's expression tightened with understanding. "Erasing your independent identity. It's a common tactic, whether conscious or not. My children did the same, donated my book collection to the university library. Before I could object, 40 years of carefully curated economic texts, first editions, signed copies, all gone. We need to accelerate our timeline, I said quietly, ensuring no staff were within earshot. Agreed. Have you made contact with your attorney? I nodded. Margaret Jenkins, no relation. She's prepared to move forward whenever I give the signal. And your financial advisor? Xavier is ready as well. He's managed my portfolio for 20 years. Complete discretion. What Eleanor and I had discovered during our private conversations in her room, the one place without monitoring, thanks to her daughter's influence on the board, was that we shared more than institutionalized frustration. We both harbored significant financial resources unknown to our families. In Eleanor's case, decades of shrewd investing had turned her professor's salary and modest inheritance into substantial wealth that her children knew nothing about. They assume I lived on my pension and the small life insurance policy from Henry's death, she had explained. They have no idea about the private accounts or the property in Vermont. For me, the secret wealth had come from a seemingly humble source: patents. As a physics teacher with a background in mechanical engineering, I had designed numerous improvements to everyday tools and machinery. While no single patent had made me rich, the accumulated royalties from 17 different inventions, all managed through a holding company separate from my personal finances, had grown steadily over 40 years. Why the secrecy? Eleanor had asked when I first revealed the extent of my hidden assets. Why not enjoy your wealth more visibly? I wanted Richard to develop his own work ethic, I explained, to build his own success without expecting inheritance. Martha knew we were comfortable, but not the full extent. After she died, it seemed unnecessary to reveal it. I didn't articulate the deeper truth, that some part of me had been testing Richard, waiting to see if he would value me beyond any potential inheritance. The current circumstances had provided a definitive, if painful, answer. Well, Eleanor had said practically, their oversight is about to become our advantage. Now, as we completed our second lap around the facility, we finalized the timing for our countermove. Monday, I decided. I'll contact Margaret then. Eleanor nodded approval. Monday it is. Synchronizing our actions will create greater impact. We paused at the entrance, both reluctant to return to the confines of the building with its artificial lighting and perpetual television noise. Do you ever wonder if we're being unfair? I asked, a moment of doubt surfacing. They believe they're protecting us. Eleanor's gaze was steady and clear. Harold, there's a profound difference between protection and control. What our children have done, however well-intentioned, has crossed that line. We're not incapacitated or incompetent. We're simply old. And age alone is not sufficient reason to strip someone of their autonomy. Her words reinforced my resolve. This wasn't about revenge or even reclaiming material possessions. It was about asserting that my life remained my own to direct, regardless of my age or physical limitations. Monday, I repeated, holding the door for Eleanor as we returned to our gilded cage. Emily arrived breathlessly at my room on Friday afternoon, a day earlier than expected, her backpack slung over one shoulder and a familiar red notebook clutched in her hand. I got it, Grandpa, she announced triumphantly after closing the door behind her. Dad let me go over early to start boxing up some of my old toys from the attic. I snuck down to the workshop when he was on a conference call. I accepted the notebook with barely concealed relief. Thank you, Sunshine. This means a great deal to me. What's so important about notes on your old tools? She asked, dropping into the visitor's chair with the casual physicality of teenagers. I considered how much to reveal to my granddaughter. Emily had always been perceptive and mature for her age, with a strong sense of justice that sometimes put her at odds with her more pragmatic parents. She was also the only family member who had genuinely objected to my placement at Peaceful Gardens. It's more than just notes on tools, I admitted, making a decision that might later prove unwise but felt right in the moment. It's part of a plan. Her eyes widened. What kind of plan? Are you breaking out of here? Because I could totally help with that. Like a prison escape, but with walkers instead of tunnels. I chuckled at her enthusiasm. Not exactly an escape, though that's not far off conceptually. More of a renegotiation of circumstances. What does that mean? It means, I said carefully, that your father and mother made decisions based on incomplete information. And on Monday, that information will be updated. Emily leaned forward, intrigued. What information? What are you going to do? I probably shouldn't tell you the details. It might put you in an awkward position with your parents. She snorted, a distinctly teenage sound of derision. I'm already in an awkward position. I think what they did to you sucks, and I tell them so at least twice a week. Her loyalty touched me deeply. Thank you for that, Sunshine. But this situation is complicated. Adult complicated. I'm 17 in 2 months, she reminded me. And I'm not an idiot. I studied my granddaughter's determined face. So, like Martha's when she'd made up her mind about something and made another decision, what I'm about to tell you needs to remain between us, at least until Monday. Can you promise me that? She nodded solemnly, drawing an X over her heart in, the same gesture she'd used since childhood to signify absolute secrecy. Over the next hour, I explained the broad outlines of my financial situation and the plan Eleanor and I had developed. Emily listened with increasing amazement, occasional questions demonstrating her quick grasp of the concepts involved. So, you're secretly rich, she summarized when I finished. And on Monday, you're going to use that money to… what? Buy your way out of here? Not exactly. The money gives me options, but this isn't about buying freedom. It's about reclaiming respect. I leaned forward, wanting her to understand the principle at stake. Your father made decisions for me without consulting me, based on the assumption that I couldn't care for myself, financially or otherwise. I'm going to demonstrate that his assumptions were incorrect. He's going to freak out, Emily predicted, though she didn't seem particularly troubled by this prospect. Especially about the house. He's already talking about how much equity he'll release from the sale. The confirmation that Richard was counting on profits from my home, which he'd had no part in building or maintaining, reinforced my resolve. There may be some adjustment required on his part, I acknowledged. But ultimately, this isn't about punishing your father. It's about establishing that I remain capable of directing my own life, with appropriate support that I choose and control. Emily nodded slowly. I get it. It's like when they still treat me like I'm 12, making decisions about my life without even asking what I want. Exactly. Different scale, but the same fundamental issue. Respect for autonomy. She was quiet for a moment, processing. So what happens after Monday? Will you come home? That's part of what remains to be determined, but I won't be staying here under the current arrangement. Emily suddenly threw her arms around me in an impulsive hug. Good. This place is killing your spirit, Grandpa. I can see it every time I visit. Her perception was uncomfortably accurate. Despite my internal resistance and quiet planning, the institutional environment had been taking its toll. The scheduled meals, the supervised medications, the patronizing activities, each small indignity eroding something essential to my sense of self. Just a few more days, I promised, returning her hug. Now, you should probably go before your absence raises questions. As she gathered her belongings, Emily paused at the door. Can I be there on Monday, when it all goes down? I considered the request. Having Emily present might actually be strategic. Richard would be less likely to react with unfiltered anger if his daughter were witnessing the conversation. Yes, I decided. Come after school as usual on Monday, around 4 hours. She departed with a conspiratorial smile that reminded me of teaching her chess years earlier, the same expression she'd worn when grasping the concept of thinking several moves ahead. After she left, I opened the red notebook and confirmed that the additional account information remained intact. Then I placed a call to Margaret Jenkins. using the private cell phone I'd kept hidden since my arrival. Another small act of resistance against institutional control. "It's time," I told her when she answered. "Monday at 4 p.m., Peaceful Gardens." "I'll be there," she confirmed in the efficient manner that had made her my attorney of choice for the past decade. Documents prepared as discussed. With that final piece in place, I settled in to endure one last weekend of institutional routine and a final Sunday visit from Richard and Patricia, knowing it would be unlike any previous encounter. Monday arrived with the heightened awareness that accompanies pivotal moments. I dressed with particular care, not in the comfortable but shapeless clothes that had become my daily uniform at Peaceful Gardens, but in pressed slacks, a blue Oxford shirt, and the cashmere sweater that Martha had given me for our last Christmas together. I even polished my leather shoes, which had remained unworn in the closet since my arrival. Eleanor and I took breakfast together in the dining room, exchanging understated nods of confirmation. She, too, had dressed more formally than usual, her appearance drawing curious glances from staff accustomed to residents who gradually surrendered to institutional blandness. "Ready for our little revolution?" she murmured as we finished our remarkably unappetizing oatmeal. "As ready as one can be for upending expectations," I replied. "Your timing is still synchronized?" "Xavier arrives at 3:30. My children at 4, same as your meeting." We had deliberately planned our revelations for the same time to prevent facility staff from interfering with either conversation. Divided attention would work in our favor. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. I attended the morning exercise class, chair yoga, modified for seniors with limited mobility, and endured the well-meaning but infantilizing instruction with outward compliance while mentally reviewing the key points I intended to make during the coming confrontation. Lunch was the usual institutional fare: overcooked vegetables, bland protein, and synthetically sweetened dessert. I ate mechanically, aware that Eleanor was doing the same at her table across the room, both of us conserving energy for the afternoon ahead. At precisely 2:45 p.m., I returned to my room to prepare. From my limited closet, I retrieved the leather portfolio Margaret had delivered discreetly through Emily 2 days earlier. Inside were copies of all the documents that would reshape my relationship with my son and the institution that currently controlled my daily existence. At 3:30, I glimpsed Xavier, a distinguished man in his 50s carrying a similar portfolio, being escorted to Eleanor's room. Right on schedule. At 3:55, Emily arrived, slightly breathless from rushing. "Did I miss anything?" she asked, eyes bright with anticipation. "Perfect timing," I assured her. "Margaret should be here any minute, and I've asked the staff to call your father." "Dad's already on his way," she informed me. "I might have mentioned you were upset and asking for him. He and Mom are coming together." I raised an eyebrow at this unauthorized addition to the plan, but couldn't fault her initiative. "Well done. Having them both here will be more efficient." At 4:03, Margaret Jenkins arrived, a tall, imposing woman in her 60s, whose no-nonsense demeanor and impeccable credentials had served me well for years. She greeted me with professional warmth, nodded to Emily, and arranged herself in one of the visitor chairs, portfolio open on her lap. At 4:08, Richard and Patricia arrived, their expressions a mixture of concern and annoyance at the unscheduled summons. "Dad? Is everything okay?" Richard asked, noticing my unusual attire and the presence of an unknown woman. "The front desk said you were asking for me urgently." "Everything is fine, Richard," I replied calmly. "Please, both of you sit down. This is Margaret Jenkins, my attorney. And of course you know Emily, who's here at my request." Richard's face immediately hardened at the word attorney, his gaze darting suspiciously between Margaret and me. "Attorney? What's going on?" "Let's discuss that directly," I said, motioning again to the chairs. "I promise this won't take long." Patricia perched uneasily on the edge of one chair while Richard remained standing, arms crossed defensively. If this is about the house, Dad, we've already explained that it needs to be sold to continue financing your care here. The teacher's pension only covers about half the monthly costs. Actually, Richard, that's precisely what we need to discuss. I nodded to Margaret, who extracted several documents from her portfolio. Mr. Jenkins, she began in her crisp, authoritative voice, has asked me to clarify some financial matters that appear to have been based on incomplete information. I'll be brief and direct. She handed Richard a bound document about 20 pages thick. This is an accounting of your father's actual financial position, which is substantially different from what you have apparently assumed. Harold Jenkins is the owner of Jenkins Innovation Holdings, a company that manages 17 different patents developed during his teaching career. The consolidated value of these holdings, plus associated investments, currently totals approximately $32 million. The shock on Richard and Patricia's faces would have been comical under different circumstances. Richard actually took a step backward, the document dangling from suddenly limp fingers. That's not possible, he stammered. Dad was a teacher. He lived carefully. The house isn't even worth that much. The house, Margaret continued smoothly, which you are currently preparing to sell, is in fact not eligible for sale. It was transferred 5 years ago into the Harold Jenkins Living Trust, with specific provisions regarding its use and disposition. She handed him another document. This is the trust agreement, which stipulates that the property cannot be sold during Harold's lifetime without his explicit consent, which he has not given. Patricia had gone pale, her hand reaching for Richard's arm as if for support. But the nursing home costs. We were told. Peaceful Gardens has already been paid in full for 1 year of care, Margaret informed them, presenting yet another document. However, Mr. Jenkins has decided that this arrangement no longer serves his needs or wishes. Richard finally found his voice, anger edging through his shock. What are you saying? That my father has been secretly wealthy all this time? That he let us believe he needed our help when he didn't? That's manipulative. I raised my hand, intervening before Margaret could respond. No, Richard. What's manipulative is making decisions about my life, my home, and my possessions without meaningful consultation. What's manipulative is telling the staff here that I'm confused about money matters to discredit anything I might say about my own finances. Emily, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, spoke up unexpectedly. You did do that, Dad. I heard you on the phone with the nurse supervisor. Richard shot her a betrayed look before turning back to me. We were trying to protect you after the fall and the stove incident. I slipped in the shower. It happens to people of all ages, I replied evenly. And I forgot to turn off the stove once, after taking medication that specifically warned about short-term memory effects. Those isolated incidents didn't justify stripping me of my home, my workshop, and my independence. Patricia, ever practical, seemed to be calculating rapidly. But if you have all this money, why live so modestly? Why let us think you needed financial help? I lived the way I chose to live, I explained. Comfort without excess, purpose without materialism. And I didn't let you think anything. I simply never saw a need to detail my financial position. When you assumed I needed assistance based on your perception of a teacher's pension, you never actually asked me about my resources or preferences. Richard was now paging through the financial summary, his expression shifting between disbelief and growing comprehension. These patent royalties, some go back to when I was in elementary school. Yes. The first was for an improved laboratory clamp design I created during my 3rd year of teaching. Not particularly lucrative on its own, but it established the pattern for what followed. Margaret cleared her throat gently. If I may continue, there are several matters requiring immediate attention. At my nod, she distributed more documents. First, Mr. Jenkins will be leaving Peaceful Gardens. Effective Saturday. Alternative living arrangements have been secured. A private residence with appropriate modifications for safety and accessibility, plus a live-in assistant who is qualified in elder care but will function as an employee rather than a caretaker. "You're leaving?" Richard asked, seemingly struggling to process this cascade of revelations. "To live where?" "In my house," I stated firmly. "The house that you are currently preparing to sell against my wishes. The house that has never actually been yours to dispose of." Patricia began to object, but Margaret continued smoothly. "Second, Mr. Jenkins has revised his estate planning in light of recent events. These documents outline the new arrangements, which substantially modify the inheritance structure previously in place." This captured Richard's full attention. "What does that mean?" I met my son's gaze directly. "It means, Richard, that I've established a generation-skipping trust. Emily will receive a significant educational trust immediately, accessible when she turns 18. The bulk of my estate will eventually pass to her as well, with specific provisions for charitable contributions to educational institutions." The implication hung silently in the air. Richard and Patricia had effectively disinherited themselves through their actions. "You're cutting us out?" Richard's voice rose in disbelief. "Because we tried to ensure you were safe and cared for?" "No," I corrected quietly. "Because you made decisions about my life based on convenience and assumptions rather than respect and consultation. Because you were preparing to dismantle my workshop and sell my home without meaningful discussion about alternatives. Because you treated me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be honored." Emily, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet through most of the exchange, spoke up again. "Dad, you always taught me that respect means listening to others and considering their feelings, even when you think you know best. But you didn't do that with Grandpa." Richard turned to her, betrayal plain on his face. "You knew about this?" "About the money, the plans to leave?" "Only since Friday," she admitted. "And I agreed with Grandpa that you needed to hear the truth. This place isn't right for him. You know it isn't." Patricia, ever the pragmatist, seemed to be recalibrating. Rapidly. "Harold, surely we can discuss this reasonably. If you have concerns about Peaceful Gardens, we could look at other facilities, perhaps more upscale options." "This isn't about the quality of the facility," I interrupted gently. "It's about the fundamental decision to institutionalize me, without exploring alternatives that would preserve my independence and dignity. It's about assumptions made and actions taken that revealed how you truly view me, as incapable and burdensome rather than experienced and valuable." The room fell, silent for a moment, the weight of truth settling uncomfortably around us. Through the open door, I could hear raised voices from down the hall, Eleanor's meeting with her children apparently progressing along similar lines. Finally, Richard spoke, his tone more subdued. "What happens now?" Margaret answered, her professional demeanor unwavering. "Mr. Jenkins will be returning to his home on Saturday. The house will be restored to his full control, with any changes made in his absence reversed to the extent possible. His workshop will remain intact. A care assistant named David Chen will be moving into the guest suite to provide support as needed while respecting Mr. Jenkins's autonomy." "And us?" Richard asked, gesturing between himself and Patricia. "What role do you envision for us in this new arrangement?" The question revealed the heart of the matter, not the money or even the house, but the fundamental relationship between us. For the first time since they'd arrived, I felt a flicker of hope that genuine understanding might eventually be possible. "That," I said quietly, "depends entirely on your willingness to relate to me as an adult with agency, rather than an obligation to be managed. I remain your father, Richard. I would like to remain actively part of your life and Emily's. But that relationship must be built on mutual respect, not control disguised as concern." Emily reached over and squeezed my hand, her young face solemn with understanding beyond her years. Richard and Patricia exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them as they absorbed the transformed reality before them. "We have a lot to think about," Richard finally said, "and apparently a lot we didn't know." "Yes," I agreed simply. On both counts, Margaret closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. "I believe we've covered the essential points for today. I'll be in touch regarding the transition details, and of course, I'm available for any questions about the revised estate documents." As she prepared to leave, a staff member appeared in the doorway, looking flustered. "Mr. Jenkins, is everything all right? We've had some unusual situations developing this afternoon." "Everything is fine," I assured her. "Just a family meeting with my attorney. I believe Mrs. Sullivan is having a similar consultation down the hall." The mention of Eleanor appeared to increase the staff member's concern, but she merely nodded and withdrew, clearly uncertain how to address the unprecedented scenario of two residents simultaneously asserting legal and financial autonomy. After Margaret departed with professional farewells, an awkward silence descended on the room. Emily, demonstrating emotional intelligence that sometimes escaped her parents, stood up. "I think you guys probably need to talk more," she said. "I'll wait in the common room, Dad." Once she had gone, Richard sank heavily into the chair she had vacated, the documents still clutched in his hand. Patricia remained perched on the edge of her seat, her expression cycling through calculation, concern, and recalibration. $32 million, Richard said finally, his voice hollow with disbelief. "All these years. Why the secrecy? Dad? Didn't you trust us?" The question cut closer to the bone than he likely realized. "It wasn't initially about trust, Richard. Your mother and I agreed early in our marriage that we wanted you to develop your own work ethic, your own path, without expectation of inherited wealth. Later, it simply never seemed necessary to discuss. We lived comfortably but modestly because that aligned with our values, not because of financial constraints. But after Mom died, when I started helping with your finances, here was the harder truth, the one I had avoided confronting directly until recent events." I took a slow breath, considering my words carefully. The moment demanded truth, even if it was uncomfortable. "After your mother died, I observed changes in how you related to me," I said evenly. "Subtle at first, more questions about my finances, suggestions about simplifying my assets, comments about the burden of maintaining the house. It seemed prudent to maintain some separation between my actual resources and what you believed you were managing." Richard flushed, anger and embarrassment warring on his face. "You thought I was after your money? Your house? My own father?" "Not consciously." "Perhaps," I replied, "but your actions revealed certain priorities. When you began discussing the equity in my home before I'd even been here 2 weeks, when you scheduled an estate sale for my workshop tools without consulting me about which held sentimental value, when you dismissed my objections as confusion, these choices suggested that my wishes were secondary to your convenience." Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "That's not fair, Harold. We were trying to be practical. The costs of this facility were never actually the issue," I interrupted gently, "as you now know. Yet financial concerns were consistently presented as the justification for decisions that fundamentally altered my life without my meaningful consent." Richard set the documents down, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so reminiscent of his teenage years that it momentarily softened my resolve. "I don't know what to say, Dad. This is overwhelming." "I understand," I acknowledged. "Finding out your father isn't who you thought he was, financially or otherwise, is disorienting. But imagine how disorienting it was for me to discover my son viewed me primarily as a responsibility to be managed rather than a person to be respected." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of unspoken expectations and assumptions. Richard looked away, his profile suddenly vulnerable, despite his 53 years. "I never meant," he began, then stopped. "It wasn't intentional." "I believe that," I said sincerely. "Your mother and I raised you to be responsible, to take care of family. But somewhere along the way, taking care of became confused with taking control from. And that's where things went wrong." Patricia, ever the practical one, steered the conversation back to immediate concerns. "So you're really leaving on Saturday? Back to the house? Are you sure that's safe?" The question revealed how deeply entrenched their perception of my incompetence had become. With appropriate modifications and support, yes. David Chen is a licensed practical nurse with specific training in elder care. He'll live in the guest suite but function as an employee, not a guardian. The arrangement preserves my independence while addressing legitimate safety concerns. "And you arranged all this without telling us," Richard noted, a hint of his earlier anger returning. "Behind our backs." "Just as you arranged my placement here without meaningful consultation," I pointed out. "The difference is that my decision restores my autonomy rather than removing it." Another uncomfortable silence descended, broken eventually by Patricia's practical nature asserting itself again. "We've already listed the house with a realtor. There's a signed contract." "Which is invalid," I reminded her. "As Margaret explained, the house is held in trust with specific provisions regarding its disposition. Any contracts you've signed as presumed owners are legally unenforceable." Richard's expression darkened further. "You let us proceed with all those arrangements knowing they were meaningless? The realtor, the estate sale company, the cleaning service. We've spent weeks organizing everything." "And I spent decades building that home, filling it with memories, creating the workshop you were so casually dismantling," I replied, my own anger finally showing through. "How much consideration did you give to my feelings about those arrangements?" The question hit its mark. Richard looked away, unable to meet my gaze directly. Patricia stood suddenly. "I think we all need some time to process this. It's a lot to absorb." She gestured vaguely at the documents still scattered across the small table. "We should go get Emily and think about next steps." I nodded, recognizing that pushing further today would only entrench defensive positions rather than building understanding. "That's reasonable. Margaret will contact you about the transition details for Saturday. I hope you'll both be involved in helping me return home, but I've made arrangements if that's not possible." Richard gathered the documents mechanically, still seemingly dazed by the revelations. At the door he paused, turning back with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Something between resentment and remorse. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he asked quietly. "About the money, the patents, any of it? Or were you just going to let me believe a fiction about who you were my entire life?" The question deserved honest consideration. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Before this situation, I hadn't felt it necessary. The money was never the point of my life, Richard, just a byproduct of work I found meaningful. But your actions forced the revelation, and perhaps that's ultimately for the best. Truth, however uncomfortable, is preferable to comfortable fiction." He nodded once, then left without further comment, Patricia following with a backward glance that mingled confusion with calculation. I understood her well enough to recognize she was already adjusting to this new reality, recalibrating their relationship to me based on my unexpected resources. After they departed, I sat quietly in my chair, emotionally drained but strangely lightened. The secret I had carried for decades was finally revealed, the consequences of that revelation still unfolding. Whether Richard would eventually understand my choices remained to be seen, but I had reclaimed control of my life, and that alone was worth the difficult conversation. A soft knock at my open door roused me from contemplation. Eleanor stood, there, leaning on her cane, her expression both weary and triumphant. May I come in? I believe we have outcomes to compare. I gestured toward the recently vacated chairs. Please. How did your meeting go? Eleanor settled herself with the careful movements of someone managing chronic pain while refusing to be defined by it. About as expected. Shock, denial, anger, bargaining, rather like the stages of grief, except they're mourning the death of assumed control rather than an actual person. A remarkably accurate description of my own experience just now, I agreed. Did you encounter resistance to your departure plans? Considerable resistance, she confirmed, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Patricia, my daughter, not your daughter-in-law, actually suggested I might need psychiatric evaluation for making such a rash decision, as if reclaiming one's autonomy at 83 were a sign of mental instability rather than simple self-respect. Richard implied I had been deliberately deceptive by not revealing my financial situation earlier, I shared, as though my privacy were somehow an offense against him rather than a personal choice. Eleanor snorted delicately. The entitlement is remarkable, isn't it? Our children genuinely believe they have the right to complete transparency from us while maintaining their own privacy. Parenthood apparently creates a permanent power differential in their minds, except it's become inverted with age. Her articulation of the dynamic so perfectly captured my own experience that I laughed despite the emotional weight of the afternoon. Exactly that. The irony is that I raised Richard to be independent and self-sufficient, never imagining he would eventually apply those same values to managing me rather than respecting my own continued independence. And now? Do you think reconciliation is possible? Eleanor's question cut to the heart of my concerns. I considered carefully before answering. Possible, yes. Likely. I'm less certain. Richard has never responded well to situations that challenge his perception of himself as the responsible party. Finding out that his father has not only significant resources but also the capacity to arrange his own affairs contrary to Richard's plans, it's a substantial blow to his self-image. Ah, the fragile male ego, Eleanor observed with the slightly mischievous smile I had come to appreciate. In my experience, it often requires time to recover from deflation before rationality can reassert itself. And your children? Do you anticipate reconciliation? Her expression sobered. Thomas, perhaps. He seemed genuinely shocked by his own behavior when Xavier laid it out objectively. Patricia? I'm less optimistic. She has too much invested in her role as the responsible daughter managing her declining mother. Surrendering that identity would require more self-reflection than she's demonstrated thus far. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, two octogenarians who had just fundamentally altered our relationships with our adult children through the revelation of long-held secrets. I've been thinking, Eleanor said eventually, about our next steps. My house in Vermont needs some updating before it would be suitable as a primary residence again. I'll be staying at a senior living apartment in town temporarily, the kind with actual independence, not this glorified nursery. But perhaps by summer we might consider some joint travel. I've always wanted to see the national parks of the Southwest, and having a traveling companion would make such an adventure more feasible. The suggestion surprised and intrigued me. In all my planning for reclaiming independence, I hadn't thought much beyond returning to my home and workshop. The idea of new adventures, particularly with someone who understood the complex balance between autonomy and realistic accommodation of aging, was unexpectedly appealing. I'd like that, I replied, realizing as I spoke that it was entirely true. Perhaps a road trip in early fall, when the desert heat has moderated. Excellent. Eleanor rose with deliberate care. Then we have a plan beyond mere escape, a positive direction rather than simply a rejection of current circumstances. As she moved toward the door, she paused. 3 more days in this place, then freedom on our own terms. 3 days, I confirmed. Manageable, knowing there's an end date. After Eleanor departed, I sat for a long time in my chair, watching the afternoon sun cast lengthening shadows across the institutional beige carpet. The conversation with Richard and Patricia had gone largely as expected, though the pain of confrontation had been sharper than anticipated. Whether our relationship could heal from this fundamental realignment remained to be seen. But as Eleanor had so insightfully observed, we now had plans that extended beyond mere rejection of our children's arrangements. We had positive directions, chosen independently and aligned with our own values rather than others' convenience. At 80, I had reclaimed not just my home and financial autonomy, but something far more precious, the right to author the final chapters of my own life story. The remaining days at Peaceful Gardens passed in a curious limbo state. Word of my impending departure, and the dramatic circumstances surrounding it, spread quickly among both residents and staff, creating a subtle shift in how I was perceived and treated. Nurses who had previously spoken to me in the slightly over-enunciated tones reserved for children and the cognitively impaired now addressed me with cautious respect. Administrators who had barely acknowledged my existence suddenly found reasons to check on my satisfaction with services. Fellow residents regarded me with expressions ranging from confusion to admiration, with several pulling me aside to whisper questions about how I had managed to secure my escape. "Is it true you're secretly a millionaire?" asked Frank Williams, a former accountant who had been at Peaceful Gardens for nearly 2 years, his voice hushed despite the empty hallway. "Not so secretly anymore," I acknowledged, "but the money is secondary to the principle involved." Frank nodded sagely. "Independence. That's what we all miss most in these places. They call it care, but it's really control wrapped in beige wallpaper and bingo nights." His articulation was so similar to discussions Eleanor and I had shared that I looked at him with new interest. Exactly that. The infantilization is perhaps the most corrosive aspect, being treated as though advanced age automatically implies reduced personhood. "My daughter brought me here after my wife died," Frank confided. "Said it would be easier than maintaining my condo. Easier for her, perhaps. I haven't baked my own muffins in 23 months. Ridiculous thing to miss, isn't it? But I was known for my blueberry muffins once." The wistfulness in his voice for such a simple pleasure highlighted everything wrong with the institutional approach to elder care. Not ridiculous at all. It's the small autonomies that define our sense of self. Frank studied me thoughtfully. "Any chance your lawyer friend might consult with others here? Not all of us have millions, but some of us have options that our children have." Overlooked. The request surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "I'll ask her," I promised. "Margaret specializes in elder law and might be able to suggest alternatives even without substantial resources." Throughout these final days, Richard maintained a conspicuous silence. No calls, no visits, no messages relayed through staff. Only Emily made contact, texting daily updates about my house. Dad canceled the estate sale company, but the painter already started in the kitchen, and her own conflicted feelings about the situation. Mom and Dad argue when they think I can't hear, mostly about control issues and trust. Sound familiar? Eleanor, meanwhile, proceeded with her own departure preparations with characteristic efficiency, holding daily meetings with Xavier and various service providers who would facilitate her transition to the independent apartment she had secured. We continued our afternoon teas, now focusing on practical plans for the coming weeks and more expansive dreams for the months ahead. "I've been researching RV rentals," she informed me over Earl Grey and contraband shortbread cookies, smuggled in by her similarly rebellious daughter-in-law. "For our national parks tour, there are surprisingly luxurious options available: proper beds, full bathrooms, even small dishwashers." "You envision us driving across the country in a recreational vehicle?" I asked, both amused and intrigued by her thoroughness. "At our age?" She arched an elegant eyebrow. Unless you'd prefer hotels and tour buses with 40 other retirees, being herded about like schoolchildren on a field trip? Point taken, I conceded with a smile. Though I should warn you that my driving has been limited to local trips for several years now. As has mine, she acknowledged. But there are services that provide drivers for such adventures. Typically retired people themselves who enjoy the travel but don't want to own the equipment. We'd have privacy and independence while outsourcing the actual operation to someone better suited for it. Once again, I was impressed by Eleanor's practical approach to balancing independence with realistic accommodations for our age-related limitations. It exemplified the nuanced perspective that our children had missed entirely. Understanding that autonomy doesn't mean refusing assistance, but rather choosing when and how that assistance is provided. That sounds ideal, I agreed. Perhaps we could start with a shorter journey, say Yellowstone and Grand Teton, before committing to a cross-country expedition? Sensible, she approved. A trial run to establish compatibility as travel companions. After all, we've only known each other within these institutional confines. Our habits and preferences in the wild, so to speak, remain untested. The way she framed our situation, as temporarily captive creatures preparing for release into natural habitats, made me laugh. A apt metaphor. Though I suspect you're considerably more adaptable than I am after decades of routine. We'll see, she replied with the slight smile that always suggested she knew more than she was saying. Adaptability is often circumstantial rather than inherent. I suspect we'll both discover unexpected flexibility when freed from this environment. On Friday afternoon, my final full day at Peaceful Gardens, Emily arrived after school, her expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I'm supposed to tell you that Dad and Mom will be at the house tomorrow morning to help with the transition, she announced after hugging me tightly. Though Dad made it clear he still has serious concerns about the arrangement. That's more than I expected, I admitted. I'd prepared for the possibility of returning without their involvement. Emily sat cross-legged on my bed, her teenage flexibility a stark contrast to my own careful movements. They've been weird all week, like super quiet with each other. And Dad keeps studying those financial papers your lawyer gave him. I think he's still in shock that his boring old physics teacher dad is secretly loaded. I winced slightly at boring old physics teacher dad, though I recognized it as typical teenage perspective rather than genuine dismissal. The money was never meant to be a secret weapon, Emily. It was simply separate from how I defined myself or my relationship with your father. But now it's kinda awesome leverage, she observed with typical adolescent directness. Dad can't exactly argue that you need their financial support anymore. True, but reconciliation will require moving beyond leverage to genuine understanding, I noted. Your father needs to recognize that this isn't about money, but about respect for autonomy. Emily rolled her eyes good-naturedly. Yeah, you might need to spell that out for him. Dad's not great with the whole emotional subtext thing. A characteristic he unfortunately inherited from me, I acknowledged. Your grandmother was much better at articulating feelings directly. Speaking of feelings, Emily ventured, suddenly, serious? Are you mad at Dad? Like, permanently mad? Because I know he messed up big time, but he really did think he was helping, in his own control-freak way. The question revealed her deeper concern, that this conflict might permanently fracture the family. I considered my response carefully, wanting to be honest without burdening her with adult complexities. I'm hurt and disappointed by his actions, I admitted, but not permanently angry. Relationships evolve, Emily. Sometimes they require significant readjustment when perspectives or circumstances change. Your father and I are in that readjustment phase now. She nodded slowly. So there's hope you guys will be okay eventually? Yes, I assured her. Different than before, perhaps, but okay. Your father and I have weathered disagreements throughout. His life. This is more substantial than most, but not insurmountable. Emily seemed relieved, flopping backward onto the bed with dramatic teenage abandon. Good, because this week has been super awkward at home with everyone acting weird and tense. Plus, I want to be able to visit you at the house without feeling like I'm choosing sides. You'll never have to choose sides, I promised firmly. Whatever tensions exist between your father and me, they don't extend to your relationship with either of us. That's an absolute. Our conversation shifted to more practical matters, what I would need help with tomorrow, which of my belongings were most important to transport carefully, how my room at home had been maintained in my absence. Emily's detailed updates about the house suggested she had been paying closer attention to the preparations than I had realized, noting which of my possessions had been packed away and which remained in their original positions. After she left, I completed my final packing, carefully sorting through the limited possessions I'd been permitted to bring to Peaceful Gardens. The framed photographs returning to their proper places on shelves and walls at home. The few books I'd been allowed, a fraction of my extensive library. The cardigan Martha had knitted for me our last Christmas together, which I had refused to leave behind despite Patricia's insistence that the facility was always kept warm. Each item represented a fragment of identity I was reclaiming. Not just physical possessions, but the associations and memories they carried. The contexts that had been stripped away by the institutional setting's emphasis on uniformity and safety over personalization and meaning. As evening approached, I made a final visit to Eleanor's room to confirm our departure arrangements for the following day. "All prepared?" she asked, gesturing to the chair across from hers at the small table where we had shared so many afternoon teas. "As much as possible," I confirmed. "Emily reports that Richard and Patricia will be at the house tomorrow morning, which was unexpected but potentially positive. Your children?" "Thomas will assist with the move to the apartment," she replied. Patricia has suddenly remembered a previously scheduled commitment that makes her unavailable. A transparent excuse, but perhaps better than forced participation with obvious resentment. I nodded, understanding. "Will Thomas continue to support your plans once you're settled?" "I believe so," Eleanor said thoughtfully. Our conversation yesterday was actually quite productive once the initial shock subsided. He acknowledged that his concern had perhaps manifested as control rather than support, particularly after Henry died. There's potential for a healthier relationship moving forward. "I'm glad," I said sincerely. Family reconciliation would be the ideal outcome of all this upheaval. "Indeed, though not at the cost of continued subjugation," she noted with characteristic precision. "Which brings me to a practical matter. I've spoken with Margaret about your friend Frank's inquiry regarding legal consultation for other residents. She's agreed to host an informational session here next month about elder rights and alternative living arrangements." The news was unexpected but welcome. That's generous of her. There are undoubtedly others here in similar situations to ours, though perhaps with fewer resources. "Resources matter less than awareness of options," Eleanor observed. "Many residents accept institutional living as inevitable, rather than one choice among many possibilities. Simply knowing alternatives exist can be transformative." We spent our final evening at Peaceful Gardens finalizing coordination for the next day and confirming plans to meet the following week once we were both settled in our respective new arrangements. As I returned to my room for the last night, I felt a curious mixture of anticipation, vindication, and lingering sadness that our children had required such dramatic measures to recognize our continued personhood beyond the simple fact of advanced. Saturday morning arrived with a sense of momentous transition. I woke early, dressed in my own clothes rather than the loose-fitting, easily managed garments favored by the facility, and completed my final preparations before breakfast. The small suitcases I had brought to Peaceful Gardens now contained the sum total of my allowed possessions, packed efficiently for transport home. Breakfast in the dining room had a surreal quality. Other residents watched with barely disguised curiosity as Eleanor and I occupied our usual table, our attire and demeanor clearly indicating the day's significance. Several approached with hushed good wishes and requests to let us know how it goes on the outside, a phrase that reinforced the prison-like quality of the institutional environment. At precisely 9:30 a.m., Margaret Jenkins arrived in the lobby, accompanied by David Chen, a compact, efficient-looking man in his early 40s who would be serving as my live-in assistant at home. Margaret made the introductions with professional courtesy. "Mr. Jenkins, this is David Chen, LPN. He has extensive experience in home-based elder care with an emphasis on preserving independence while ensuring safety." David's handshake was firm, his manner respectful without being patronizing. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Jenkins. I've reviewed your medical information and home assessment. I believe we can create an arrangement that supports your needs while respecting your autonomy." His choice of words, specifically supports, rather, than manages, and the emphasis on respect, confirmed that Margaret had selected him with careful attention to my priorities. "Thank you, David. I appreciate your approach." As we completed the discharge paperwork at the front desk, a process Margaret supervised with eagle-eyed attention to detail, I caught sight of Eleanor across the lobby, engaged in similar procedures, with Xavier and her son Thomas. She caught my eye and offered a subtle nod of solidarity, one escapee acknowledging another's imminent freedom. The facility administrator, who had never shown particular interest in me during my 3-month stay, suddenly appeared with concerned efficiency. "Mr. Jenkins, are you certain about this decision? Our medical team has some reservations about your safety in a non-supervised environment." Margaret intervened smoothly before I could respond. "Those concerns have been thoroughly addressed. In the home care plan, which was reviewed and approved by Mr. Jenkins's primary physician, all appropriate safeguards are in place." The administrator seemed prepared to object further, but something in Margaret's expression, a subtle warning, of potential legal complications should they attempt to obstruct my departure, apparently changed her mind. "Well then, we wish you the best of luck, Mr. Jenkins. Your room will be held for 30 days should you wish to return." "That won't be necessary," I assured her, signing the final form with a flourish that perhaps contained more satisfaction than the situation strictly required. David efficiently loaded my suitcases into Margaret's car, and with remarkably little ceremony, my time at Peaceful Gardens came to an end. I paused briefly in the doorway, turning to catch Eleanor's eye. Once more, she raised her cane slightly in a subtle salute, her expression conveying everything words couldn't: shared triumph, vindication, and the promise of continued friendship beyond these institutional walls. The drive to my home took exactly 23 minutes, a journey I had made hundreds of times before being relocated to Peaceful Gardens, and one I had feared I might never make again. As familiar landscapes replaced the sterile corridors of the facility, I felt a gradual easing of tension I hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. "Your son called this morning to confirm he and his wife would meet us at the house," Margaret informed me as we turned onto my street. "He sounded subdued but cooperative." I nodded, unsurprised by Richard's continued emotional struggle with the situation. "He's processing a substantial shift in his understanding of me and our relationship. It will take time." As we pulled into the driveway of the craftsman-style home I had built in 1972, I felt a surge of emotion at the sight of its familiar lines and the mature oak trees I had planted as saplings when Richard was a boy. The house needed exterior. Painting in the garden showed signs of recent neglect, but it remained fundamentally as I had created it: solid, well-proportioned, built to last generations. Richard's SUV was already parked in front of the garage, and as Margaret's car came to a stop, the front door opened. Richard emerged with Patricia close behind, both wearing expressions of careful neutrality. Emily bounded past them with no such restraint, rushing to the car with enthusiastic welcome. Grandpa, welcome home, she exclaimed as David helped me navigate the transition from car to standing. We've been getting everything ready all morning. Her genuine delight provided a welcome counterbalance to her parents' obvious discomfort. I embraced her warmly, then turned to face Richard and Patricia, who had approached with more measured steps. Dad, Richard acknowledged with a slight nod. The house is prepared as you requested. We've, returned everything to its original position as best we could. Thank you, I replied, matching his formal tone while looking past him to the home I had feared I might never see again. I appreciate your assistance with the transition. Patricia, ever practical, intervened in the awkward moment. David's room is all set up in the guest suite. We found some new linens for the bed and cleared space in the closet. She turned to David with forced brightness. If you need anything else, just let us know. David thanked her with professional courtesy, then suggested, perhaps we should get Mr. Jenkins settled inside. It's been a significant morning already. The transition into the house proceeded with the strange formality of people who know each other intimately but have suddenly found themselves on unfamiliar relational terrain. Richard carried my suitcases to the master bedroom, while Patricia provided a detailed update on household matters, which appliances had been recently serviced, which plants had been maintained, which neighbors had asked about my absence. I moved through the rooms slowly, reacquainting myself with spaces that contained 50 years of memories. The living room with its riverstone fireplace I had constructed by hand, the dining room where countless family meals had unfolded, the sun porch where Martha and I had spent evenings watching birds at the feeders. Each space both familiar and slightly altered by the brief period of my absence, subtle rearrangements and adjustments that reflected Richard and Patricia's preparations for selling. When we reached my workshop at the back of the house, I paused, at the doorway, bracing myself for what I might find. The space had been my sanctuary for decades, a carefully organized universe of tools, projects, and possibilities that represented not just hobby, but identity. To my surprise and relief, the workshop appeared largely untouched. My lathe stood in its usual position, the overhead tool rack maintained its careful organization, the workbench remained clear except for my precise arrangement of most used implements. We hadn't started packing this room yet, Richard explained, misinterpreting my hesitation. The estate sale company was scheduled to inventory it next week. I nodded, moving to the workbench and running my hand along its smooth surface. Worn to a patina by decades of projects, from the cradle I had crafted for Richard's birth to the jewelry box I had completed for Emily's 16th birthday just months before my fall. This space, I said quietly, represents 50 years of creation and problem-solving. Every piece of furniture in the house that matters to me came from this workshop. It would have been difficult to see it dismantled. Richard shifted uncomfortably. We didn't realize. That is, we thought you were done with woodworking. After the fall? A single fall doesn't erase half a century of skill and passion, I replied, more sharply than intended. Taking a breath, I added more gently, the workshop can be modified, for safety without being eliminated. Seated workstations, emergency call systems, scheduled times when David can be present for more challenging operations, adaptation rather than abandonment. Richard looked away, clearly struggling with a complex mixture of emotions, defensiveness about his decisions, lingering shock at my financial revelations, uncertainty about our new dynamic, and perhaps genuine remorse about what he now recognized as overreaching. Emily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during our tour of the house, spoke up. Dad and I cleaned all the tools yesterday, and I organized your sandpaper collection by grit, the way you taught me. Her simple statement, evidence of care, and attention to details that mattered to me, provided a welcome bridge across the chasm of discomfort. Thank you, sunshine. That's exactly right. As we returned to the main part of the house, Margaret and David were reviewing care arrangements. In the kitchen, the scheduled timing of medications, emergency response protocols, nutrition planning, physical therapy appointments, all the practical matters that would support my continued independence without compromising safety. Mr. Jenkins will maintain full decision-making authority regarding daily activities and schedule, David explained for everyone's benefit. My role is supportive rather than directive. I'll ensure medications are available on schedule, assist with physically demanding tasks, provide transportation to appointments, and maintain communication with medical providers. And if there's an emergency? Patricia asked, her tone suggesting she anticipated disaster. If he falls again, or there's a fire, or… Emergency response protocols are comprehensive, David assured her, indicating the documentation Margaret had prepared. The house has been fitted with a medical alert system that contacts both emergency services and me directly if activated. Smoke and carbon monoxide detectors are linked to the security system. Mr. Jenkins will carry a personal alert device that functions throughout the property, including the workshop. The detailed planning answered the legitimate safety concerns without surrendering the autonomy that had been so cavalierly stripped away at Peaceful Gardens. It represented exactly the balanced approach I had sought from the beginning. Recognition of age-related vulnerabilities without the wholesale infantilization that institutional care had imposed. As the afternoon progressed, the initial awkwardness gradually eased into a more practical cooperation. Richard assembled the new adjustable bed that would replace my traditional mattress, making it easier to get up and down safely. Patricia organized the kitchen with frequently used items at accessible heights. Emily helped me arrange my study, replacing the books that had been packed away, setting up my computer, ensuring my reading chair had proper lighting. Throughout these activities, David observed carefully, occasionally making notes, but never interfering unless asked for input. His presence was supportive without being intrusive, exactly what I had specified to Margaret when describing my requirements for in-home assistance. By late afternoon, the essential arrangements were complete. The house had been transformed, from a property being prepared for sale back into my home, with appropriate modifications for safety, but without the institutional atmosphere I had dreaded might be necessary. As Richard and Patricia prepared to leave, the underlying tension that had been temporarily submerged in practical activities resurfaced. We stood somewhat awkwardly in the living room, the fundamental realignment of our relationship still raw and unresolved despite the day's cooperative work. The refrigerator is stocked for the week, Patricia said, filling the uncomfortable silence with logistics. And I've left a list of the neighbors who still drive if you need additional groceries. Before you're ready to go yourself. Thank you, I replied sincerely. You've both been very helpful today despite the difficult circumstances. Richard nodded stiffly, still struggling to find comfortable footing in our transformed relationship. We'll check in tomorrow to see if you need anything else. And Emily can come by after school Monday if that works for you. I'd like that, I assured him, then added carefully, and perhaps later in the week we could have dinner together? Just the two of us. There are conversations we should have without an audience. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by cautious consideration. Yes, that would be good. Wednesday evening, maybe? Wednesday would be fine, I agreed, recognizing the small opening toward reconciliation contained in his acceptance. After they departed, Emily with a fierce hug and whispered, I knew you'd find a way, Grandpa. I settled into my familiar reading chair by the living room window, the emotional and physical exertion of the day finally catching up with me. David discreetly busied himself organizing his own space in the guest suite, providing the solitude I suddenly craved after months of institutional living with its constant supervision and lack of privacy. The house felt both wonderfully familiar and slightly strange, the sensation, perhaps, of returning to a well-loved space after recognizing how close I had come to losing it permanently. The quality of light through the windows I had designed, the subtle creaks of floorboards I had laid with my own hands, the arrangement of furnishings that reflected decades of family life and personal preference rather than institutional efficiency. I must have dozed off in the chair, because the next thing I registered was David gently placing a light blanket over my legs and adjusting a pillow behind my head. "Sorry to disturb you, Mr. Jenkins. It's nearly dinner time. Would you prefer to eat in the dining room or here by the window?" The simple question, offering choice rather than directive, crystallized everything I had fought to reclaim. Not extravagant freedom or reckless independence, but the basic dignity of decisions about my own daily existence. "The dining room, I think," I replied, appreciating both the option and the respectful way it was presented. "And please call me Harold. Mr. Jenkins feels unnecessarily formal for someone living in my home." David nodded with a small smile. "Harold, then. I've prepared a simple meal based on the dietary information in your file, but I'd appreciate your input on preferences for future planning." As we moved to the dining room, my movements careful but steady after months of determined physical therapy at Peaceful Gardens, my phone chimed with an incoming text. It was from Eleanor, a simple message. "Freedom achieved. Apartment satisfactory. Thomas moderately chastened. Plans proceeding for fall adventure. Dinner next week to compare notes?" I smiled at her characteristic efficiency even in personal communication. The promise of continued friendship with someone who truly understood this journey from institutional control to reclaimed autonomy was yet another unexpected gift emerging from difficult circumstances. Over dinner, a well-prepared salmon with vegetables that immediately highlighted the vast difference between home cooking and institutional food, David and I established the basic parameters of our working relationship. My schedule preferences, his responsibilities, the boundaries that would ensure both my safety and his appropriate privacy in the shared living arrangement. Throughout the conversation, he maintained the perfect balance between professional competence and personal respect, confirming Margaret's excellent judgment in selecting him. "I understand from Ms. Jenkins that you were a physics teacher and continue to have interest in scientific developments," David mentioned as we finished our meal. "I studied pre-med before switching to nursing and still try to keep up with research. Publications. Perhaps that's something we might discuss occasionally, if you're interested." The suggestion, clearly aimed at establishing a relationship based on shared intellectual interests rather than merely caregiver and patient, indicated a perceptiveness I hadn't anticipated. "I'd enjoy that," I replied sincerely. "My subscription to Scientific American should be redirected here soon. In the meantime, there's an extensive collection of journals in my study that you're welcome to browse." After dinner, I moved to the sun porch that had been Martha's favorite room, a space designed to capture the evening light through carefully positioned windows. The familiar comfort of the wicker furniture she had selected, the view of the garden now showing early spring growth, the bird feeders that needed refilling after months of neglect, each element reinforced my sense of homecoming. David brought me tea without being asked, then discreetly withdrew to his own quarters, intuitively understanding my need for solitude after the emotional complexity of the day. Alone for the first time in my own home since being whisked away to Peaceful Gardens, I allowed myself to fully experience the relief and vindication of this moment. I had done it. Against my children's expectations, against institutional inertia, against the pervasive societal assumption that advanced age automatically diminished personhood, I had reclaimed my rightful place and autonomy. Not without help, certainly. Margaret's legal expertise, Eleanor's solidarity, Emily's unwavering support, and now David's professional assistance, all had been essential components of this restoration. But the central assertion, that I remained capable of directing my own life with appropriate support of my choosing, had been definitively established. As darkness fell outside the windows, I thought of the other residents still at Peaceful Gardens, Frank with his longing for homemade blueberry muffins, Irene, who spoke wistfully of her abandoned garden, Thomas, who had been a renowned pianist but was limited to the facility's out-of-tune upright. How many of them had alternatives they hadn't considered? How many had families who had made similar decisions based on convenience rather than necessity? Margaret's planned informational session might open doors for some. For others, institutional care was perhaps truly the safest option given their particular health challenges or lack of resources. But the fundamental principle remained. Choice and agency should be preserved to the greatest extent possible, accommodating safety concerns without unnecessarily sacrificing dignity. These reflections were interrupted by another text message. Chime. This time from Richard. Hope you're settling in well. Emily insists on baking you cookies tomorrow. Apparently they're essential for proper homecomings. Let us know if that timing works. The message, casual in tone but significant in content, suggested he was making an effort to establish a new dynamic between us, acknowledging my independence while maintaining family connection. It represented a small but meaningful step toward the reconciliation I hoped might eventually be possible. I replied affirmatively about the cookies, then prepared for my first night back in my own bedroom. As David helped me navigate the evening medication schedule, a legitimate safety concern given my history of occasionally forgetting doses, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. My children had sent me to a nursing home, never imagining I had a secret fortune that would ultimately enable my escape. But the deeper truth was that money, while a powerful tool in this situation, had simply been the mechanism rather than the meaning of my reclaimed independence. The real victory lay in the assertion of personhood that transcended financial resources, the fundamental human right to dignity, respect, and agency, regardless of age. If my experience could somehow help others recognize and reclaim those rights, perhaps the pain and struggle of these past months would serve a purpose beyond my individual liberation. As I settled into my own bed for the first time in 3 months, surrounded by familiar possessions and freed from institutional constraints, I felt a profound sense of peace mingled with anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in this reconfigured life. But they would be challenges faced on my terms, in my home, with my autonomy intact. The secret fortune had opened the door. What truly mattered was the life I would now create by walking through it. The adjustment to my new living arrangement proceeded more smoothly than I had anticipated. David proved to be not just competent, but genuinely pleasant company, intellectually curious, respectful of boundaries, and possessed of a dry wit that often matched my own. He maintained the perfect balance between necessary assistance and preservation of independence, intervening only when truly needed and otherwise allowing me to manage daily activities at my own pace. Emily became a frequent visitor, often arriving directly after school to share her day's experiences while helping with small projects around the house. Her presence bridged the still somewhat strained relationship with Richard and Patricia, who maintained a careful politeness during their less frequent visits, while clearly still processing the dramatic reshaping of our family dynamic. Dad's been reading books about senior independence and supporting aging parents without controlling them, Emily reported with characteristic directness about 2 weeks after my return home. He left them out on the coffee table where I'd totally see them, so I think it's kind of a message that he's trying. That's encouraging, I acknowledged, genuinely appreciative of Richard's efforts to educate himself. Changes in perspective rarely happen overnight, especially when they involve deeply ingrained assumptions. He's also been talking to Uncle James about how Grandma Louise handled Great-Grandpa's last years, she continued, referring to Martha's brother and father. Apparently, Great-Grandpa stayed in his own house until he was 94 with just a part-time helper. Dad seemed surprised by that. This additional information was particularly meaningful, Richard actively seeking alternative models of elder care rather than simply defaulting to the institutional approach that had seemed so inevitable to him before. It suggested a genuine reconsideration, rather than mere adaptation to circumstances he couldn't control. My promised dinner with Richard took place the Wednesday after my return home. David tactfully arranged to be absent, preparing our meal in advance before departing for errands that would conveniently require several hours. The privacy allowed for a conversation that had been building since the dramatic revelations at Peaceful Gardens. "The house looks good," Richard observed as we settled at the dining room table, his gaze taking in the familiar space now subtly modified with safety features that remained largely unobtrusive. "The adaptations aren't as medical as I expected." "That was intentional," I explained. "Modern universal design principles can accommodate safety needs without institutional appearance. The grab bars in the bathroom, for instance, they're designed to blend with the towel racks rather than screaming disability equipment." Richard nodded, sampling the roast David had prepared. "This is excellent. He seems competent." "He is, both professionally and personally." Margaret selected him specifically for his approach to elder care, supporting independence rather than imposing limitations. A slightly uncomfortable silence fell, the unspoken issues between us hovering, like a physical presence at the table. Finally, Richard set down his fork and looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology, Dad," he said, the words clearly difficult but sincere. "Not just for not knowing about your financial situation. That was your choice to keep private. But for how we handled the decisions after your fall. I didn't consult you meaningfully. I assumed I knew what was best and proceeded accordingly." The straightforward acknowledgement, without defensiveness or qualification, surprised and moved me. "Thank you for saying that, Richard. It means a great deal." "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past weeks," he continued, "about how quickly we moved from Dad had a fall to Dad needs to be in a facility. Looking back, there were many intermediate options we never seriously considered." He hesitated, then added, "Options that would have preserved your independence while addressing legitimate safety concerns, like what you've arranged now." "Why do you think that happened?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective rather than seeking to assign blame. Richard considered the question thoughtfully. "Partly fear, I think. The idea of you being injured again, perhaps more seriously, with no one to help." He shook his head. "But also convenience, if I'm being honest with myself. A facility with full-time staff meant I wouldn't have to reorganize my life to provide the support you might need." The self-awareness in his response indicated significant reflection rather than mere appeasement. "That's a very honest assessment," I acknowledged, and the fear was not entirely unwarranted. The fall was serious. It could have been worse. But fear led to overreaction, Richard concluded. And once we started down the institutional path, momentum carried us forward without adequate reassessment. He met my gaze directly. "I am sorry, Dad. Truly." "I accept your apology," I said, simply. "And I hope we can build something better from here. A relationship based on mutual respect rather than paternalistic protection." Richard nodded, relief evident in his expression. "I'd like that." After a moment, he added with a hint of his old humor, "Though I have to say, finding out my modest high school teacher father is actually worth millions was a bit of a shock to the system." I smiled at the tentative lightening of tone. "Not quite the retirement portfolio you imagined I was working with. Not remotely." He shook his head in lingering disbelief. "All those years of careful budgeting, buying generic brands, driving cars until they practically disintegrated? Was any of that actually necessary? Financially necessary? No," I admitted. "But the values those choices represented were genuine. Your mother and I believed in living simply, avoiding waste, finding satisfaction in creation rather than consumption. The accumulation of wealth was a side effect of work I found meaningful, not the purpose of it. But why the secrecy, especially after Mom died?" The question contained no accusation now, just genuine curiosity. I considered how to explain decisions that had evolved over decades without conscious planning. It began as a desire for you to develop your own work ethic without expectation of inherited wealth. Later, it simply never seemed relevant to disclose the full extent of my financial situation. I paused, then added the harder truth we both needed to acknowledge. After your mother died, I began to notice subtle changes in how you approached my aging. Increased concern, certainly, but also increased direction rather than consultation. The finances seemed like one area where I could maintain complete autonomy without conflict. In retrospect, perhaps maintaining that separation contributed to the misunderstandings that followed. Richard absorbed this with remarkable equanimity, considering how critical it might have sounded. "I can see that," he acknowledged. "I did start viewing you differently after Mom died, more as someone who needed management rather than as an adult fully capable of directing his own life. I didn't recognize I was doing it at the time, but looking back, it's embarrassingly obvious." The conversation continued through dinner and beyond, extending to the sun porch where we had often sat with Martha during family visits. We discussed practical matters, how my new living arrangement would work long-term, what role Richard and his family would play in my life moving forward, how we would balance independence with appropriate support as my needs potentially increased with advancing age. More importantly, we began rebuilding trust, the foundation of any healthy relationship that had been severely damaged by recent events. Richard's willingness to acknowledge his missteps without defensiveness created space for genuine reconciliation rather than mere accommodation to changed circumstances. As he prepared to leave, Richard paused at the door. "There's one thing I'm still curious about. How did you manage to arrange everything so thoroughly while at Peaceful Gardens? The legal work, the home modifications, hiring David, it was all remarkably comprehensive for someone who was supposedly under constant supervision." I smiled, appreciating his recognition of the logistical achievement involved. "I had help. Margaret handled most of the legal and financial arrangements. Emily was an invaluable messenger at critical moments." I hesitated, then added, "And I had a co-conspirator at Peaceful Gardens, another resident in a similar situation." "The economics professor?" Richard guessed. "Emily mentioned you had become friends with someone there." "Eleanor Sullivan," I confirmed. "A remarkable woman, with her own story of family well-intentioned but overreaching. We coordinated our escapes for maximum effectiveness." Richard shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. "I have to admit, the synchronized revelation was impressively strategic. The facility administrator was completely overwhelmed trying to manage both situations simultaneously." "That was intentional," I acknowledged. "Eleanor taught game theory at the university level for decades. Her contributions to our tactical planning were invaluable." As Richard departed with a genuine hug rather than the perfunctory embrace that had characterized recent interactions, I felt a cautious optimism about our relationship moving forward. The damage would not be repaired overnight, but the foundation for rebuilding had been established. True healing would require consistent demonstration on both sides. My continued clarity about boundaries and expectations, Richard's ongoing respect for my autonomy despite legitimate safety concerns. But the conversation had marked a significant step toward a healthier dynamic than either the unspoken tensions before my institutionalization or the dramatic rupture that followed. Over the following weeks, my life settled into new patterns that balanced independence with practical accommodations for age-related limitations. David's presence provided security without surveillance, assistance without intrusion. My workshop became a sanctuary once again, though now with modified equipment and scheduled times when David would be present for more physically demanding projects. Eleanor and I maintained regular contact, meeting weekly for lunch at a cafe midway between our respective new residences. Her temporary apartment, while not as personally significant as my reclaimed home, represented a similar victory of autonomy over institutional control. "Thomas has become almost comically attentive," she reported during one of these lunch meetings. calling daily to ask if I need anything, bringing groceries unasked, suggesting various services he could arrange. It would be annoying if it weren't such an improvement over his previous approach of making decisions without consultation. Richard exhibits similar behavior, I noted with understanding. Excessive attentiveness as a correction to previous overreach. I suspect it's partly genuine remorse and partly fear that I might implement further financial consequences if dissatisfied. Eleanor's eyes twinkled with mischief. The latter is not entirely unwarranted, at least in my case. I've made it quite clear to my children that future inheritance remains contingent on continued respect for my autonomy. A somewhat mercenary approach, I observed with a smile. Pragmatic, she corrected primly. I began with fundamentals, wood selection, grain orientation, basic tool safety, finding unexpected pleasure in articulating knowledge accumulated over decades of practice. I never realized how much science is involved, Richard observed as I explained the mathematics of proper joinery. I always saw woodworking as primarily artistic rather than technical. It's both, I explained. The technical understanding enables the artistic expression. You can't create freely without first mastering the underlying principles of the medium. As Richard awkwardly but determinedly practiced basic cutting techniques, I found myself reflecting on the strange path that had led to this moment of connection. If not for the dramatic rupture caused by my institutionalization and subsequent escape, would we ever have found our way to this shared appreciation? Sometimes, it seemed, relationships required breaking before they could be rebuilt into stronger, more authentic forms. Emily joined our workshop sessions occasionally, her teenage impatience balanced by natural dexterity that often surpassed her father's more methodical approach. The three of us gradually began work on a project of my design, a writing desk, for Emily's upcoming college years, with each of us contributing different elements based on our developing skills. These family workshop sessions became a highlight of my week, reinforcing the sense that the painful journey through Peaceful Gardens had ultimately led to unexpected gifts. Not just the reclamation of my home and autonomy, but a deeper, more honest relationship with my son and a meaningful connection with my granddaughter that transcended the typical grandparent-grandchild dynamic. 3 months after my departure from Peaceful Gardens, Eleanor and I met for our weekly lunch with a specific agenda, finalizing details for our upcoming National Parks adventure. The RV service had been secured, itinerary confirmed, and necessary accommodations arranged for our 3-week journey scheduled to begin in mid-September. The driver seems suitable, Eleanor reported, reviewing her detailed notes. Former park ranger, experienced with the vehicle type, familiar with all destinations on our itinerary. And, perhaps most importantly, comfortable with the concept of providing transportation rather than supervision. Essential distinction, I agreed. And the medical considerations? Addressed comprehensively. She indicated a section of her meticulously organized binder. Nearest facilities mapped for each stopping point, arrangements for prescription refills if needed, satellite communications for emergency services in remote areas, prudent preparation without paranoia. As we worked through the remaining logistical details, a familiar voice interrupted our planning session. "Professor Sullivan? Mr. Jenkins? What a surprise!" We looked up to find Frank Williams approaching our table, accompanied by a middle-aged woman with his same distinctive nose and chin. The transformation in Frank's appearance since I had last seen him at Peaceful Gardens was remarkable. His posture more upright, his expression animated rather than resigned, his clothing personal rather than institutional. "Frank," I greeted him warmly, "you're looking well. How are you?" "Liberated," he replied with evident satisfaction. "Thanks in no small part to your attorney's excellent advice. This is my daughter Angela," he added, indicating his companion. "Angela, these are the conspirators I told you about. The ones who engineered the Great Escape and inspired my own liberation." Angela extended her hand with a slightly chagrined smile. I owe you both thanks. Dad's situation at Green Tree Apartments is so much better suited to his actual needs. I should have explored those options before assuming Peaceful Gardens was the only safe choice. Many families make similar assumptions, Eleanor observed graciously. The important thing is recognizing alternatives when they're presented and being willing to reconsider initial decisions. Frank explained that Margaret's informational session had led to productive conversations with Angela about alternative living arrangements. After visiting several facilities together, a collaborative exploration rather than unilateral decision-making, they had selected an independent senior apartment complex with optional support services tailored to individual needs. I bake muffins every Sunday now, Frank reported proudly. Blueberry, just like I used to. Angela and her kids come for brunch and take the extras home, and I have a small garden on my balcony. Nothing extensive, but enough to grow herbs and a few tomatoes. The simple pleasures he described, baking, familiar recipes, tending plants, hosting family on his terms, highlighted once again the profound importance of autonomy in maintaining identity and purpose regardless of age. Not extravagant independence or rejection of necessary support, but the fundamental dignity of choice and self-direction within realistic parameters. After Frank and Angela departed with warm wishes for our upcoming adventure, Eleanor and I exchanged significant glances. Another success story, she noted with satisfaction. Perhaps we should consider documenting these transitions more formally. A collection of case studies demonstrating alternative approaches to elder care beyond the institutional default. The suggestion aligned with thoughts I'd been considering recently. Something accessible for families navigating these decisions, I agreed. Practical rather than accusatory in tone, emphasizing collaborative approaches rather than binary options. A project for winter, perhaps, Eleanor suggested. After our grand adventure and before my planned return to Vermont in the spring. The casual reference to Eleanor's longer-term plans reminded me that our current arrangements were temporary by design. Not just my living situation with David's support or Eleanor's transitional apartment, but the broader pattern of our lives. In this final chapter, we were each constructing paths that honored our individual priorities while accommodating the realities of advancing age, continually reassessing and adjusting, rather than surrendering to predetermined outcomes. This dynamic approach, ongoing, evaluation and adaptation rather than fixed solutions, seemed the essence of meaningful aging. Not denying limitations or refusing appropriate assistance, but maintaining agency in determining how that assistance would be integrated into lives that remained fundamentally our own to direct. As summer transitioned to early fall, final, preparations for our national parks journey intensified. David helped modify my usual medication routine to accommodate travel requirements, while Eleanor coordinated with Xavier on financial arrangements that would ensure seamless access to resources throughout the trip. Richard's initial concerns about the expedition gave way to reluctant support after reviewing our comprehensive planning documents and speaking with the professional guide we had engaged. Patricia remained skeptical but refrained from direct opposition, recognizing from recent experience that attempting to prevent my chosen activities would likely prove both futile and damaging to our improving relationship. Emily, by contrast, embraced the adventure with characteristic enthusiasm. "I think it's totally awesome, Grandpa," she declared while helping me select appropriate clothing for variable mountain climates. "Most people your age just sit around waiting for family to visit or watching game shows. You're out there living, while you can." Her phrasing, "living while you can," captured precisely the philosophy that had driven my escape from Peaceful Gardens and subsequent reclamation of autonomy. Not reckless denial of mortality or rejection of reasonable precautions, but deliberate choice to remain engaged with life's possibilities, regardless of numerical age. 1 week before our scheduled departure, I invited Richard, Patricia, and Emily for a special dinner to celebrate the near completion of our workshop project. The writing desk we had been crafting together over the past months was now finished, except for the final finish coat. A beautiful piece combining my decades of expertise, Richard's newly developed skills, and Emily's creative design contributions. As we gathered in the dining room, the atmosphere was notably different from the tense, awkward meal we had shared shortly after my return from Peaceful Gardens. Conversation flowed naturally, including David as a welcomed participant rather than mere staff. Emily proudly demonstrated the specialized features she had designed for the desk: hidden compartments, customized organization systems, integrated lighting, while Richard described the joinery techniques he had mastered during the project. "It's not perfect," he acknowledged, indicating a slightly uneven drawer pull. "But considering it's my first real woodworking project, I'm pretty satisfied." "Craftsmanship isn't about perfection," I noted. "It's about intention, care, and continuous improvement. Each piece teaches something that improves the next." After dinner, as Richard and Patricia prepared to leave, my son lingered in the workshop, running his hand along the smooth surface of the completed desk. "I understand something better now," he said thoughtfully, "about why being here, in this house with your workshop intact, matters so much to you. It's not just familiarity or comfort. It's continuity of purpose." The observation demonstrated a depth of understanding I hadn't been certain Richard would achieve. "Exactly that," I agreed. "At any age, having purpose, creating, contributing, engaging meaningfully with the world, is essential to well-being. Peaceful Gardens offered safety, but stripped away purpose." "I see that now," he acknowledged. "The activities there, bingo, sing-alongs, craft projects designed for children, they were diversions, not meaningful engagement." He looked directly at me, his expression serious. "I'm sorry we didn't recognize that distinction when making decisions about your care." "You're recognizing it now," I pointed out. "That's what matters moving forward." As we walked back to the main part of the house, Richard surprised me with an unexpected question. "This national parks trip with Eleanor, it's important to you, isn't it? Beyond just a vacation or scenery." "Very important," I confirmed. "It represents choice, agency, adventure still possible at 80. Not just freedom from institutional constraints, but freedom to pursue new experiences despite age-related limitations." He nodded slowly. "Then I hope it's everything you're anticipating. And I hope you'll share it with us when you return. Photos, stories, all of it." "I'd like that," I replied, touched by his effort to support rather than discourage this venture that clearly still triggered some anxiety for him. "Perhaps a special dinner when we return. Eleanor could join us. I think you'd enjoy getting to know her better." "I'd like that too," he agreed. "From the little interaction we've had, she seems formidable." "An accurate assessment," I confirmed with a smile. "Brilliant mind, zero tolerance for condescension, and strategic thinking that would impress military generals. She's been an unexpected gift in this late chapter of life." Something in my tone must have suggested more than mere friendship, because Richard gave me a questioning look. "Are you and Eleanor collaborators, allies, friends with shared experience and perspective?" I replied, deliberately addressing the implied question. "Whether that evolves into something more remains to be seen. At 80, labels seem less important than the simple value of meaningful connection." This candid acknowledgement of potential romantic possibility at my age clearly surprised Richard, challenging yet another unconscious assumption about the parameters of elderly life. He recovered quickly, however, demonstrating the increased adaptability he had been developing. "Well, she seems remarkable, and you deserve companionship of whatever kind brings you joy." The simple statement, recognizing my continuing capacity for relationship development rather than viewing me as emotionally static or completed, represented yet another step in our evolving understanding. Not just tolerance of my independence, but genuine support for continued growth and possibility, regardless of chronological age. The morning of our departure dawned clear and cool, Perfect weather for the beginning of our adventure. David had helped me pack efficiently, focusing on practical needs while ensuring my medications were organized for the entire journey. The RV service had arranged for our driver, Michael, to collect us in a well-appointed vehicle that balanced comfort with maneuverability, large enough for comfortable living but not so massive as to limit access to scenic areas. Eleanor arrived precisely on schedule, dressed in practical travel clothing, but with her characteristic touch of elegance, a silk scarf adding color to the otherwise utilitarian outfit. She greeted David and Michael with her usual combination of courtesy and clear expectations, reviewing our itinerary one final time before we departed. "Everything is in order," she confirmed, consulting her meticulous notes. "Reservations confirmed at all planned stops, weather forecasts favorable for the next week, emergency protocols established." Richard, Patricia, and Emily arrived to see us off, bringing a basket of homemade snacks for the journey. Emily captured photographs of Eleanor and me standing beside the RV, documenting what she declared the coolest grandparent road trip ever. As final goodbyes were exchanged and we prepared to depart, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had preceded this physical one. From the enforced passivity of peaceful gardens to this moment of deliberate adventure, the contrast could hardly have been more profound. "Ready for our expedition, Harold?" Eleanor asked as Michael helped us board the vehicle that would be our home for the next 3 weeks. "More than ready," I replied with genuine anticipation. "It's been too long since I've seen mountains that weren't in photographs." The RV pulled away from my driveway, Richard and Emily waving from the curb until we turned the corner. Eleanor settled into her seat with a contented sigh, already opening a detailed guidebook to Yellowstone's geological features. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding documentation of alternative elder care approaches," she remarked as we reached the highway. "Perhaps this journey could provide relevant material, demonstrating that appropriate support can enable continued exploration rather than mere maintenance." "A case study in balancing adventure with practical accommodation," I agreed, appreciating how her mind consistently moved between immediate experience and broader implications. Though I suspect most families would consider a 3-week RV journey through national parks somewhat extreme as a first step away from institutional care. Eleanor smiled at this understatement. "True, perhaps we're outliers in terms of specific application, but the principle remains valid. Aging doesn't require surrender of meaningful engagement with the world, merely thoughtful adaptation to changing capabilities." Our driver, Michael, proved to be exactly as promised, knowledgeable about our route and destinations, respectful of our autonomy, and possessed of a quiet humor that complemented our own conversational style. He understood intuitively when to engage and when to provide privacy, maintaining the perfect balance between necessary assistance and unobtrusive support. The journey to our first major destination, Grand Teton National Park, would take 2 days of comfortable travel. As familiar landscapes gave way to increasingly dramatic terrain, I found myself watching not just the scenery, but Eleanor's responses to it. Her quiet appreciation of certain vistas, her analytical interest in geological formations, her dry observations about tourist behaviors at various stops along the way. Our evening accommodations, a well-positioned RV site with views of distant mountains, provided comfortable space without excessive luxury. Michael efficiently handled the technical aspects of setting up, then discreetly retired to his separate quarters at the rear of the vehicle after confirming our needs were met. "This exceeds my expectations," Eleanor commented as we enjoyed a simple dinner at the built-in table, watching sunset colors transform the distant peaks. "The appropriate balance of adventure and reasonable accommodation." I nodded agreement, thinking of how different this evening was from those spent in the sterile common room at Peaceful Gardens. Here was beauty, stimulation, the quiet satisfaction of independent movement through the world, all elements systematically removed from institutional environments in the name of safety and efficiency. "We made the right decision," I observed. Not just in leaving peaceful gardens, but in choosing this particular method of reclaiming engagement with the world. Indeed, Eleanor agreed, though I suspect our personal histories made us particularly suited for this approach. My academic background in analyzing systems, your engineering perspective on practical problem solving, both created the mental framework for identifying and implementing alternatives to the standard institutional model. Her observation raised an important consideration about our ongoing documentation project. Not everyone has those advantages. Our case studies will need to address varying levels of resource and capability. Precisely, she nodded approvingly. Different pathways, appropriate to different circumstances, but all preserving maximum possible autonomy within reasonable safety parameters. As darkness fell over the landscape and stars emerged with breathtaking clarity absent from city skies, our conversation shifted to more personal reflections. Experiences that had shaped our approaches to aging, losses that had redirected life, trajectories, discoveries that continued despite advancing years. Henry and I planned extensive travel after retirement, Eleanor shared, referring to her late husband. His health declined too rapidly to realize those plans. For years afterward, I set aside the idea entirely, as if pursuing those dreams alone would somehow dishonor our shared intentions. Martha and I had similar plans, I acknowledged. Her cancer diagnosis came just as I was finalizing retirement arrangements. All our careful preparation for someday suddenly compressed into a few precious months of right now. And yet, here we are, Eleanor observed, gesturing to encompass our current adventure. Not precisely as originally envisioned, considerably later than planned, but nonetheless engaged in meaningful exploration rather than passive waiting. The simple observation captured the essence of our shared philosophy: adaptation rather than surrender, reimagining rather than abandoning, continuing, to write our life stories rather than accepting premature conclusion. As we prepared for our first night in the RV, establishing comfortable routines that accommodated physical limitations without dwelling on them, I found myself filled with quiet anticipation for the journey ahead. Not just the physical exploration of magnificent landscapes, but the continuing evolution of this unexpected friendship that had emerged from shared institutional resistance. The following days unfolded with a pleasant rhythm of travel, exploration, and discovery. Grand Teton National Park revealed its dramatic beauty through morning mists and afternoon clarity, while Yellowstone's geothermal wonders provided both visual spectacle and intellectual stimulation. Michael's knowledge of less crowded viewpoints and optimal timing for various attractions enhanced our experience immeasurably, allowing us to avoid the worst of tourist congestion while maximizing access appropriate to our physical capabilities. Throughout these experiences, Eleanor proved to be an ideal traveling companion, intellectually engaged, practically adaptable, and possessed of a dry humor that often matched my own. We established comfortable patterns of togetherness and solitude, each respecting the other's need for periodic independence while sharing observations that enriched mutual appreciation of our surroundings. One evening, as we watched Old Faithful's predictable yet still impressive eruption from a well-positioned bench, Eleanor made an observation that crystallized something I had been considering throughout our journey. "It's interesting, isn't it?" she mused. "How we attribute value to reliability and predictability in natural phenomena like this geyser, yet resist those same qualities when applied to human aging. Everyone wants Old Faithful to perform exactly as expected, on schedule. No one suggests it should retire from erupting or be contained for safety reasons. Nature is permitted to age on its own terms," I agreed, appreciating the insight. "Erosion creates canyons we travel thousands of miles to admire,